Hello, my name is Cameron Vinsel, and I am here doing my fourth craft presentation. And I did my presentation on narrative structure. And I don't know, a lot of you guys probably thought the same thing when looking over this for a topic to pick. I feel like narrative structure was a pretty broad one, but as the book said, it is very important. So it's kind of encompasses a lot of things, but without it, it's its importance is known, is what I'm saying. So I decided to go with narrative structure. So what is narrative structure? The book described it as a term that encompasses all the elements in storytelling. It includes different things like theme, flows through a plot, character settings, and the point of view that you are writing in. And so, again, just a lot of things about this narrative structure. It's not saying there's a complete blueprint for how your structure should be for when you're writing a narrative story or a short story, but it's the groundwork that makes a good story. And we went on and talk about this I don't know how to say this, Aristotelian theory. I'm sorry. Um, Kind of went on to talk about this a little bit. That's the early analysis of Greek tragedy, and that even every story has a beginning, middle, and end. And if you have these things, this narrative structure, all these elements create this, which leads to having a beginning, a middle, and an end. Again, it may seem like a pedestrian advice to writers. It seems pretty simple, but I think it's worth diving into, especially on the early on stages of writing like us, to see, make sure we're having control over our stories. And also in this toolbox to help with these elements, like the theme, we have different hooks, symbols, dialogue between characters, exposition, and tone. So, beginning, the setup. This is where, I said right here, the setup, where it usually starts. And so, begins with exposition. We are introduced to the main characters and their world that they live in. I think that's very important, and I feel like it sets the protagonist up in a way that you want to portray him. So I feel like everything's justified in terms of the protagonist, different reactions, actions, motivations, and it's important to talk about the world that they're in too. Would we want the protagonist walking down the street if we're looking to write a story in 1970? Would we have our protagonist walking with an iPhone? Probably not. So setting up the main characters in the world that they live in, it really adds suspension and disbelief for the reader. It really lets them picture the story in their heads of what they can expect by clues that you leave in this exposition. The other part of this beginning is the inciting incident. So that puts the actual protagonist in the position like that will make or break them. It puts them in the plot, getting them ready for the conflict that they'll face. It's inevitable that they will. It's that inevitable trajectory that the book talked about. It's gonna go up and it's gonna come down. It's that slope, and we're right here. We're going up right now, so we're getting ready for the top, and it can overlap with this. The second part was that the middle ground, and it's also very important. It's what is set up, what was set up in the beginning from the exposition in the beginning, and so the protagonist begins to respond to the incident. So here we're in the middle ground. Here, he or she, the protagonist is reacting. It's like a mind game. It's deciding what we're gonna do here. They encounter the conflict, and this is where the antagonist really comes into play. You know, we realize that it's not going to be straightforward, and our protagonist is going to have to overcome a situation that's introduced to him. And this antagonist, that's where this conflict or circumstance can be brought on by this. So it doesn't have to be a person, another character, another idea, a theme within the story, but they encounter it through the antagonist. So that's the rising action, and then we hop right into the falling action, still in this middle ground. The protagonist changes their approach. Said that twice just to relay the importance of it, I guess. There's side conflicts that come with this. You know, if the first approach doesn't work in a story, it's inevitable they're going to try again. And that's not a bad thing when trying to tell a story. You know, you fail once, don't, keep trying. And that's a life lesson. That's one thing that really is important when you're reading a story is you want to see the protagonist keep trying. And so as a writer, it's okay to let them suffer. Let them feel the falling action of it. Let them feel that they can't get it the first time, that they have to come up with something to do to save themselves. I think that's important when talking about the middle ground of a story and when they're reaching the conflict. Ending is the third part to that narrative structure. Again, we'll go back the beginning, middle, and end of this theory with narrative structure. Ending is the resolution of what was set up by the beginning and by the middle. So this is the climax. We all know what climax is. It's the fireworks of the whole story, and this is the high point. And you have to ask yourself, is the protagonist going to be triumphant? Most stories, yes, but this tension has to snap. Something has to happen that the protagonist has to either change from, or there has to be some action that comes from that. It's at this moment where they win or lose. All the possibilities of rising and falling action have been exhausted. There's only one thing left to do at this point, and that's the snap we're talking about. This is like the final countdown. There's no choice but to, like, boom, something's going to happen. Denouement. I did not know how to pronounce that before this class, I will say that. It kind of brings... It's like a closer. We're bringing in the closer in like a baseball game. It's like our closing after all is said and done. Where do we leave our protagonist? It can be lengthy, it can be short. It's like the last sigh of where we're at after this climax, and we want to leave the reader with something to think about. And so that was kind of a brief overview of the beginning, middle, and end, and I'm sure you guys knew most of those parts. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I think it is important for us to go over those three and kind of talk about all in one setting. So a good example that I thought of when looking at this was a story I read earlier for our reading section 2 weeks ago, and that was The Gift of the Magi, written by O. Henry. It's a phenomenal story. I really encourage anyone to read it, but written by O. Henry, but it clearly has a beginning and middle and end, which I love, and it's the structure is great. In the beginning, they have this exposition that we talked about of explaining the characters and explaining their world that they live in. It sets the position up for the characters. It talked about the characters not having any money. They live in a cheap part of town. It's Christmas time. Everyone's buying gifts, and they don't really have anything. It talks about the world around them is really dull, really gray, and it just kind of sets the mood that there's just not a whole lot there. And the reason why O. Henry does this is because he wants the spirit of Christmas and the spirit of love to outgrow that. It's just interesting how his words and his actions set the position for that love and that Christmas spirit to outgrow that beginning. We get to the middle. They encounter the problem. Now, the problem is they don't have any money, and it's a husband and a wife, and they're looking to buy themselves some Christmas presents, and they don't know what they're going to do. They don't have any money, and so it's just really frustrating for the husband and wife because they care about each other so much, and they don't have enough money to buy the gifts, and so they counter. They take their most prized possessions and they sell them for the money to buy them gifts. So they encounter the problem. Look, in the middle here, they encounter the conflict, then they change the approach in the following action. In the story, they encounter the problem with no money, so they counter and they sell their most prized possessions, hardly the one of the only things that they have, and to get the money, to get them a present. So I thought that was a great example of rising and falling action. I didn't put an ending here, just because I want to go back to this slide. In the story, the high point, they buy each other gifts with the money that they gave, that they got from when they sold their gifts. But the present that they bought was a complimentary product to each other's greatest possession, but they already sold them. And so, just kind of an odd and a different story, of irony. But we were talking about the denouement, and the closing section of that story was just unbelievable. And it talks about the gift of Christmas, and where do we leave the protagonist? Well, it drew it out, and they were just like, wow, we really sold our most prized possessions for money to buy a gift that we used for the possession. So it was just an interesting ending, I thought, to it. I encourage you guys to give it a read and see what you come up with. But what can we or I do with my story, The Ride of Our Lives? If nobody knows, my story was about a deep sea fishing trip kind of going wrong in a boat trip that my characters really didn't know if they were going to make it or not. And I would like to add some following action into my story. I can change Greg and I's plan to survive the storm. And in my story, I really didn't have like a counter to the storm or a counter to, like, I was just like, we were hanging on for dear life and kind of left it at that. So I'd love to add some following action to kind of balance that out, like the gift of the Magi did with the no money, and then they sold their possessions to get money. Focus on a better flow. I kind of want to review my strategy. This is a clear beginning, middle, and end, and it doesn't have to be like that necessarily, but I'd like to see how I kind of started my story with a section of the ending, and then like a flashback, and then went beginning, middle, end. Just kind of looking at that and seeing how I can get that to flow better. Insert symbols and focus on the tone. We talked a lot about keeping in our toolbox at the beginning. Right here, we talked about tone and symbols, and it includes themes and flow. And so, excuse me, trying to keep that all together, making sure it flows well. Right here, sorry. Inserting symbols and focusing on the tone again, making sure that the tone, the dialogue, that it just it works in with this flow here. And let the various stages of story interact and build off each other. And so, reading my feedback, one of the things that people would like to see was the friendship between me and Greg, and how, like, where it came from, why we're still friends. And I think that I can use that friendship and build off of that, the dialogue of us, and kind of use more dialogue to talk about like the friendship and talk about our bond that we have, and use that theme of friendship within the beginning, middle, and end, and play on that theme, and maybe like the importance of friendship is what got us through it, and we can get through anything together. So kind of looking at a friendship as a theme here. So what are 3 takeaways from this narrative structure section that we can all use, some advice? One, I thought about, we can all ask ourselves, is your story actually a story? Does it have a beginning, middle, and end? Is there rise and falling action? Is there even conflict? Does your protagonist encounter difficulty? You can have a story without those things, but I feel like if you ask yourself these questions and kind of make a little checklist, that it's going to make our story so much better. The second thing is, remember that toolbox we talked about and help spice it up. Why do we use a toolbox in real life? And my answer was to fix things. And so let's use our narrative toolbox the same way, and let's use these hooks to grab the reader's attention at the beginning and set that beginning off with a great tone, or use some symbols, use some dialogue to help set the tone for the theme of the story and how it's told. So just remember that toolbox that we talked about in the first slide. And 3, I put solve puzzles and connect the dots. Think of the relationship between the main elements of beginning, middle, and end as kind of like an imperfect symmetry is what I thought of. Do they flow together? A good example of that is like the inciting incident is resolved by the climax. The rising action is countered by the falling action. And so there's pairs and there's things that work together within the story that should fit well. And so yes, that was my 4th craft presentation. A little long, sorry about that, but I would appreciate any comments and feedback. Thank you.